Welcome to this week's live event hosted by the Committee for Workers International. Today's discussion is on revolts in Latin America and the Corona catastrophe. The CWI, as many of you will know, is a world socialist organisation which brings together Marxists and working class fighters across the world. I'm Sarah Sachs-Aldridge. I'm a member of the Socialist Party in England and Wales, which is the CWI here, and I've got the enormous privilege today of hosting today's discussion, and I'm going to introduce you to our speakers shortly. The corona, though, I think it's important to note, does put us in an absolutely unique situation where the working class across the world is suffering the same situation simultaneously, and that makes it incredibly important for international discussion like this today. So before we get started, well, we're just making sure the sound is good, the light is good, everything's good. We're just going to try and build up our audience a bit, and we'll ask you to help us with that. If you can share the link to this on any pages or groups that you're involved in, if you can alert your friends or people who might be interested in a discussion around Latin America by typing their names into the comment box below. And we also want to hear from you during it. You can comment below, but also email us at via the website socialistworld.net, and I've been given some more contact details. There's also Twitter, which is at CWI Socialist. There's our page on Facebook, which is Socialist World-CWI. There's Instagram at Socialist World, and all our streams are available live and to watch after on our YouTube channel, which is CWI Media. So hopefully you got all of that, and people can post it in the comments below as well. But to get on to today's discussion, because as we know, the human cost of the corona catastrophe is mounting up. The latest official global death toll is 287,000 dead. It's sadly a tragic underestimate, as we know. Billions of people are being plunged into unemployment, and poverty and starvation looms. In Latin America, if you look at the pictures of the curve of the death toll, in almost every country it's heading only in one direction, which is upwards. A human tragedy is unfolding. And you would really have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by the images from Ecuador of the corpses piling up on the streets and in the homes of the families, the bereaved families. COVID is increasingly exposed as an anti-working class disease. Overwork and poverty are its henchmen. Overcrowding of workers in cities helps the virus attack, and in Latin America the cities are vast and dense. And the capitalist classes have failed to build and develop infrastructure. If you think about the 13 million living in Brazil's favelas, capitalism has really prepared the way for this COVID crisis. Neoliberal policies and its attendant inequality make lucrative breeding grounds for the virus. Latin America was a testing ground for capitalism's neoliberal policies, and today we can see reports of, for example, in Peru, working class families denied oxygen to keep their loved ones alive because of the private companies hiking prices. Reaction is a feature of the situation in Latin America. Bolsonaro in Brazil, coups in Venezuela, but we've also seen a response in the reaction with general strikes and mass movements, including in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador and Chile. Bolsonaro has actually been described by the Lancet medical journal as the biggest obstacle to dealing with COVID in Brazil. And beyond the immediate health crisis, there is the deep and growing economic crisis across the continent. Argentina's economy minister himself says that Argentina's debt is unfinanceable, unaffordable and unsustainable. Now we're going to be looking at Chile today, and the uprising in Chile was itself triggered by some of this enormous inequality. And if you haven't done so, I would recommend that you read this analysis, the Constituent Assembly and other questions arising from the recent uprising in Latin America, which particularly looks at Chile. You can find that on the CWI website. But in Chile, it does appear that the government which was put on the back foot by the mass movement which started last October, has attempted to retake the initiative and to take some acts of revenge using the COVID laws to attack protesters on May Day, appointing one of Pinochet's relations as a women's and equality minister. But our speakers are going to tell us a lot more about this. So I think if I'm going to get the okay from our tech people here, that we're doing all right, everything's working okay, that's great, we can proceed with this live event. The CWI has fought to maintain support for the ideas of Marxism in Latin America over decades. We're going to be joined today by Tony Saunois, the secretary of the CWI, who spent years in the Chilean underground, working there, fighting for socialism. And the whole CWI benefits from that, and also from the fact that we have members in Chile who have many years' experience and able to share with us the lessons of the situation today and the past. So today's discussion is going to be able to illuminate the processes taking place in Latin America and the tasks for the working class in the fight for the socialist change so desperately needed, as revealed especially by these crises today. So I'll shut up now and introduce the speakers. Firstly, we've got Patricio Guzman from Socialismo Revolucionario in Chile. Hello, Patricio.
Hello, nice.
And we've got Tony Saunois, Secretary of the CWI. Hello, Tony.
Hi, hello.
Okay, so my first question is to Patricio. And we're just going to ask a general question, really. Can you outline the situation in Chile today, please? We had, as I said, the social uprising that took place from last October. But now, with the health crisis, it seems that the right-wing Pinera government has been able to stabilise and attack protesters. We've seen the army deployed. So can you tell us about the current situation, please?
Well, the current situation is still marked by the popular insurrection in the streets from October on. But it's clear that the big change has operated due to the coronavirus. The population is with a mix of rage against all kind of abuses, but at the same time afraid because in spite our health minister said that we have the best health system in the world. People know that it's a big lie. Our health system collapses every year on winter, and we are 2 or 3 months from winter now. So it's clear that with coronavirus, it will collapse. At the same time, the government is more interested in taking measures against what is clear a new social unrest on way, and they are wasting a lot of money for the military police Carabineros de Chile, instead of dedicate this money to the very urgent needs to stop the coronavirus. So it's a real scandal. Now, there's still some protest movements with people taking a lot of measures against contagious, but by now they are limited. For example, the government, when they take back the political initiative, did 2 things. First, they declared a night curfew and they took militaries to the streets. And second, they approved in parliament a law that allowed to suspend any labor relation without dismiss the workers. That means without paying any compensation. So they stop paying salaries and they don't pay compensation for dismissal. It's a very, very difficult situation for a lot of people. There are 1 million people in this situation now. Chile has 18 million inhabitants. So the situation is very difficult, especially for poor people, middle class workers. Almost all economical activities are stopped. You need to understand what it means in a country in Latin America. For example, in Chile, I suppose that's a country with better numbers than other countries. A quarter of the labor population live on a base day without proper works, selling things in the streets, doing all kind of those things. All that is stopped because the curfews, the quarantines, so people is in a very difficult situation. And for the government, the main problem seems to be a problem of control, policy control. They don't implement social measures that are very, very urgent. I think this is a global picture where we are. From the other side, political parties and trade unions, most of them, hasn't given any answer. They were paralyzed, or worse than that, they support the government. For example, in Parliament, this anti-workers law that I was telling you before was approved by all the parties except a very tiny one, the Partido Humanista. From 3 deputies they had, 2 voted against. But in total, 7 deputies only vote against from 150. That gives you the picture of a working class without a direction. The opposition simply disappears in Chile. That's the main problem. There's no leadership in a very, very difficult situation.
Thank you very much, Patricio. In fact, you covered some of the answers, the questions.
Sorry,
that I
speak too much.
That's very good. And I think we had some questions about the situation in the health service, which you've touched on. I know we've got a video on the health service workers. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add about the situation there. Patricio?
Let's see the video.
Oh, sorry.
Where is the video?
Okay. And you've touched there on the left parties and so on. I think it's playing now. I don't know if Patricio can see it.
Okay, we can talk in the meanwhile.
It's only a couple of seconds, but it's showing some health workers protesting.
No, it's not.
Oh. I can't actually see it right now. You'll have to bear with us. We're getting there. We're developing these skills and talents. But maybe we'll move on to Tony. We'll come back to these. Oh, yeah. Okay. We're going to move on to a question to Tony, and we'll come back to you, Patricio, in a couple of moments. But we'll turn to Tony now, and we'll pan out a bit from Chile to other parts of Latin America, and historically, the role of the US ruling class has been a factor in events in Latin America. Under Trump, that obviously has not changed. He's continued the attacks on Venezuela and Cuba. Sanctions, for example, have continued. So why is that? What do these attacks represent in the situation today?
Well, I think it's a number of things. Obviously, US imperialism and Trump is still operating on the basis that it's desperate to try and overthrow the Cuban regime. It's desperate to try and get rid of the Maduro government in Venezuela as well. And within that, it's quite interesting because it reflects other processes, because it's partly Trump wanting to assert his role, the vicious right-wingers that they're linked with in both Venezuela and amongst some of the Cuban exiles in the United States. They want to try and use that in the run-up to the presidential election. Behind it, though, is also another factor, because US imperialism has been pushed further back in terms of its position as a global power, and that's reflected in Latin America as well. And we've seen the assertion of Chinese investment, of Chinese influence throughout the continent. And that's been reflected partly in what's taken place in Venezuela in the recent period. You've had the intervention by US imperialism. You've had this farcical position of the mercenaries that went in to try and organize a campaign of destabilization of the Maduro regime. And of course, we as socialists have very strong criticisms of the Maduro regime. In no way do we have a socialist situation in terms of the society which exists in Venezuela, but we're completely opposed to US imperialist intervention. They've intervened in almost like a farcical position, which is reminiscent of what happened with the Bay of Pigs in 1961 in Cuba. And contained within that is a desire. They've had a build-up of the American fleet off the Venezuelan coast, and they were trying to instigate again a coup against the Venezuelan government. And of course, part of that is also the petrol's put on the fire because of China's intervention, which has been very much to support the Venezuelan regime, has big investments there now, and likewise with Cuba, because obviously they want to try and cripple the Cuban regime. They've maintained the sanctions, which is absolutely exposes the hypocrisy of US imperialism. They're maintaining the sanctions against Cuba. China has broken those sanctions and recently sent aid packages to Cuba, and behind that you see the development of a conflict for a struggle of influence between US imperialism and Chinese capitalism, which is intervening throughout the continent as well. But what they've denounced Cuba for, and the maintenance of the sanctions, it really demonstrates the hypocrisy of US imperialism. We, of course, have seen from the Cuban Revolution great gains in terms of education, and in particular in terms of the health service. We've seen, unfortunately, steps towards capitalist restoration in Cuba, but there is still a powerful legacy contained within the health system, and we've seen that reflected in the pandemic which has taken place. One of the features of Cuba is it's always had a very large number of doctors. It's a legacy in great part of the Cuban Revolution. And there's now 30,000, it's staggering when you consider it, 30,000 Cuban doctors are deployed in 67 different countries. A little island like Cuba been able to deploy such resources. They've been sent now to Spain, to Italy during the course of this pandemic, to South Africa as well. And that's partly a legacy of the Cuban Revolution. It's also the Cuban regime attempting to extend its influence and get round the American sanctions as well. And it will undoubtedly all be used as part of the campaign in the run-up to the presidential election by Trump as a campaign against socialism, of trying to imply that the Maduro regime is presiding over a socialist society, which unfortunately it is not, but nevertheless they want it out. But nevertheless, that's what we see reflected in this response of Trump towards Venezuela and towards Cuba in the recent period.
Thanks, Tony. And I'd also like to ask you a bit about another part of the continent, about how you see things developing in Brazil, because Bolsonaro is basically part of Trump's ilk, isn't he? Reactionary, encouraging right-wing forces, unbothered about the environment and so on. And like Trump, his response to the corona crisis appears to be quite mad. Most recently, saying he was going to invite thousands to a barbecue at his house, opening up nail bars and so on. Where is Brazil going under his premiership and in general in terms of the class struggle? Because under him we've also seen the massive general strike. So how do you see the situation developing in Brazil?
Well, where Brazil is going under Bolsonaro's presidency is fundamentally it's going to the dogs in terms of the policies that he's been introduced. Bolsonaro, really, you could say there's 3 or 4 particularly crazed figures involved in running capitalist governments around the world at this stage. You have Trump, obviously, in the United States, followed by Bolsonaro in Brazil, Johnson here in Britain, and probably Piñera in Chile as well would be added to that particular list. And Bolsonaro, of course, has unleashed a whole series of attacks against the Brazilian working class. That has been enormously compounded now, of course, by the onset of the pandemic crisis. And Bolsonaro's reaction has been absolutely horrific. He's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Brazilian workers, particularly from the poorest sections of Brazilian society. And it's a measure of what's taking place. I mean, the figures out of Brazil, like elsewhere, completely underestimate, the official figures that is, underestimate totally what the situation is. There was a report I was reading earlier today. They now are estimating the real figure of corona infections in Brazil is probably somewhere in the order of approaching 1 million people at this stage. I mean, you know, the government's putting out absolutely ridiculous figures of only a few thousand being infected because of Bolsonaro's insane policy of denying there was a problem, of undermining everything. But it's had another effect, because coupled with this is the crisis gripping Brazilian society, the collapse of the Brazilian economy, plunging millions more into devastating poverty, into the favelas of Rio, Sao Paulo and the other major cities. We see attacks taking place. He's bolstered up the loggers in Amazonia, which is having a devastating effect on the environment and the indigenous peoples in the Amazon region in particular. And as you see in other Latin American countries, it's not uniform, but also, for example, in Mexico, there's been a similar development as well. Because of the collapse of the state structures, particularly in the poorer areas, during the course of this crisis, you see the drug trafficking gangs have stepped in to the position. We can see there on the video some of the horrors of what this crisis is representing. Those are events taking place in Ecuador with bodies on the streets piling up. It's absolutely horrific, the situation there. But the gangs have stepped in because the state is largely not present. And according to some of the reports today, you now have the drug cartels are organising food distribution in Mexico City, in particular, in some other areas where the drug wars is being fought out. And the same is taking place in the slums of Rio. So it's an horrific position, but it's provoked splits. You've had splits taking place in the Bolsonaro government. You've seen a major fall in his approval ratings in the course of the recent period. There have been protests take place against his government in a highly charged and polarised situation. And you've even had reports of the army reacting against Bolsonaro's insanity and has taken measures into its own hand. And there's been a bit of a tendency there in Brazil to what you've also seen in the United States, of a certain fracturing with the state apparatus, in the sense that you've had local states have acted in complete defiance, in opposition to what the federal government has been advising them to do. And there's been an element of that in Brazil. There's also, incidentally, an element of that here in Britain as well, with the Scottish, the Welsh and the Northern Irish devolved governments coming out with a different policy to what Johnson has implemented over the course of the last couple of days. But it's leading to an explosive position in Brazil, a highly polarised position, with the prospects of splits opening up inside the Bolsonaro's regime, and the prospects at a certain stage of a move against him. You couldn't rule out, it's been posed already, the question of moves towards impeach him. That's a very lengthy process, but it will have to be fought out. The problem is whether the left is able to come forward and the trade unions are able to come forward with a sufficiently combative programme to fight the position through. But it's highly polarised, and it's already resulted in a fall in support for Bolsonaro's government. And I would just conclude by making a point here, because we've seen in Latin America in general in the last few years, the election, because of the failure of previous governments of the so-called left, we've seen the elections of governments of the right in a series of countries. But very rapidly, those governments to the right run into problems. That was the case in Argentina, hit 4 or 5 general strikes in a very short space of time. That is the case in Brazil prior to the outbreak of this pandemic. Chile, it's taken, well, it was quite rapid in Chile as well, as Patricio, I'm sure, will explain later, the massive social upheavals which took place there last year. And it's, you know, these governments of the right, brutal as they are, I mean, we have reports, for example, of the authoritarian measures that they've introduced. If you take El Salvador, it was quite stunning what has happened in the last few days, I think, or the last week or so, where the presidency, he's not in control of the parliament in El Salvador. Couldn't get his own way, or they were questioning him. It's controlled by the ex-guerrilla organizations of majority in the parliament. And he simply marched into the parliament with armed detachments from the army and took over the speaker's chair and effectively dissolved the Congress to impose his position. So you have authoritarian measures throughout the continent, which are quite brutal in the tradition of the right in Latin America. But it's preparing the way for an explosive position, and there will be a backlash, a massive backlash at a certain stage against the Bolsonaro government. Of that, I think we can be very confident, but it won't be pretty because of the poverty, the social disintegration which has taken place there and has ravaged whole sections of Brazilian society.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, one of the things I read was that one of the groups that's been made very vulnerable to the crisis in Brazil is the 7 million maids that exist there, an expression of the inequality, but also the way that this crisis is hitting those already made vulnerable by capitalism, and the need for working class united struggle really to take up those vulnerable sections of society's needs and demands. And it does really feel like we're in an era of unprecedented rapidity of events, a pace of events, doesn't it? And it really is, like you said, reflecting the absence of the mass organisations of the working class, the mass parties of the left and so on. But as you've just been saying, the ruling class really cannot work out what is the way forward. Not whether they're going to attack the working class or not. Of course they are, to maintain their system and their position of exploitation of the working class, but on the best way to defend their system they don't seem to be able to agree, because, as you say, they do fear backlash and they fear social unrest. And that really brings us, I think, back to Patricio, back to Chile, where there was that huge movement, that social unrest that we saw just before this crisis now. So you touched on this briefly, Patricio, but I think people would like to know a bit more really about the perspectives for the movement. Do you see a potential revival of that movement? I think we've got some footage of protests on May Day being attacked by the army, which we'll try and get up in a moment. But just a few questions, I suppose, about the perspectives for the movement. At its height, the demand was being raised up for a constituent assembly. What are the prospects for that demand to be taken up again? What are the prospects for it to be achieved? And also, what is the CWI's approach, Socialismo Revolucionario, in Chile's approach to that demand, and how are we able to participate and support the movement? I think they're some of the things that members and supporters around the world would be very interested to hear what you've got to say about.
Well, this is not a question, this is a kind of questionary. Look, first, I'm sure that the movement will erupt again. The situation after October and the months that follow has changed in a way that people is back in the homes mostly, not all of them, of course, but the networks that start during the protest are very alive, especially in poor neighborhoods. People is trying to help one to other with common foods and things like that. And the people that is in charge of those is the same people that were mobilized before. So it's not that they disappear. They are very alive. The problem, as you know, that it wasn't an spontaneous movement in the sense that there were not organizations. There were thousands of local organizations, but there was not a kind of party structure. There was not a common program. They just mobilized against the government. And the demand of a constituent assembly, you ask, wasn't a demand from the political structures. It was very spontaneous. I myself was very surprised in a monster demonstration in Santiago, maybe 2 million people, because the people came from the working class neighborhoods with their own, poster they prepare at home, and maybe a quarter of them demand constituent assembly. The demand that the political parties in the left also has retired. So what the political parties did in parliament was something very nasty. They, after a huge general strike in November, they arrived to an agreement to call a referendum. But the referendum was not to decide for a constituent assembly, but for a very shorter body with less attributions. And there were many matters they couldn't change. Of course, the core of capitalism in the constitution. In this time, only some parties in the left in parliament oppose the Frente Amplio, the Wild Front divide. Most the Wild Front support this decision, but it caused a break in the political body, especially the opposition was majority outside parliament. The Communist Party and the Humanist Party opposed, but all the others supported. And it seems for a while that in spite of the opposition from the street, there was no way to stop this maneuver. Now, in spite it was a maneuver from the power to stop the movement didn't stop. They were very worried about that. And at the same time, the far right that is in government, was a very worry because they thought that in spite the maneuver, it may open a political crisis anyway against the constitution. This is one of the support of the economic regime, not just political regime. So with the corona, what they have done is say they are not conditions for the referendum, and they propose, we don't know when for. And second thing is that some people say that this is not more necessary. So the political maneuver is a very short legs. We, with many other people, still demanding the mass demand constituent assembly through a revolutionary way. That means for us, it's not a decision from the heights, elites, the parliament, but a decision from the people organized in the factories, in the workplaces, in the working class neighbors. This will be a main political battle in the months immediately after the corona crisis. Because if people really organize themselves to win a kind of constitutional assembly, what we'll have immediately will be a situation of double power. What is now in struggling between the forces, the class forces here is who will have the power. The struggle is not just for economic demands. It's not just against abuses. It's will we support more and more those corrupt bourgeoisie politics, or will have a working class power instead? And many people, not much politicized, they are fed up with what we have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patricio. I apologise for the number of questions, but I think people around the world are very keen to hear about the process, and hopefully we'll hear more as the situation develops. But I want to turn now back to Tony, really, about the more general picture in Latin America, and as Patricio was touching on there, the perspectives. What is the situation going to look like post-pandemic? We've had an element of the role of the working class being revealed in this crisis, but we've also, as you both have mentioned, the huge suffering that it's brought in its wake. So how do you see things developing after the immediate pandemic crisis?
Well, I think it will be a similar story, only probably more intense than what we're going to see in a whole series of continents, because we had to factor in what's happening economically in the course of this crisis, and it's devastating Latin America, as of course it is other areas of the world. And I think that is going to be the central point, and the issue that Patricio touched on there with such confidence is the fact that in Chile they're not going to avoid a revival of the movement. All of the issues that triggered the movement in Chile before this crisis are not only still present, they've got worse. And that is the situation that is really reflected in all Latin American countries. This crisis has enormously polarized the situation further. The gap between rich and poor, the brutality which has been displayed in a series of countries in terms of a move towards more authoritarian measures has been sharpened. In Paraguay, I mean, I don't think they've had a formal military coup, but in terms of what the army's done, it's been virtually a de facto reintroduction of militarization of Paraguayan society. And you've had that replicated, as I mentioned earlier, in El Salvador. And I think as this crisis develops further, it's going to explode further. But there is another issue which is going to emerge and has already begun to emerge in Latin America and indeed in Asia and Africa as well. You see, capitalism internationally, through this crisis, has stepped in with massive stimulus packages, and they're going for a massive explosion of debt to finance and try and manage their way through this crisis. The International Monetary Fund is speculating at the present time that on average in the advanced industrialized countries, i.e. the main imperialist powers is what they really mean, the debt to GDP ratio will go up to about 120% on average in the advanced capitalist countries. Now, in the advanced capitalist countries, the industrialized countries, they can partly carry that. They can carry it for a period. In the neo-colonial world in Latin America, that is an entirely different question. With the scale of the debt and what it is accumulating and what it's eating up of the economy, and you've seen that partly reflected by, I think, what you mentioned at your introduction, Sarah, with what's happened in Argentina. There's been a partial postponement of the repayment, at least a part of the debt. And the issue of the debt is going to resurface as a major issue. And as the CWI, we would demand the non-payment of the debt and the nationalisation of the banks. But that is definitely going to emerge in the short term. But throughout the continent, you have the growth of far-right forces. We cannot deny that and close our eyes to it. They base themselves on a certain section within society, but it's going to be a highly polarised position throughout the continent, with intense class battles are going to open up. And the issue is, as we've seen previously in Latin America, can the workers' movement be successful in rebuilding powerful mass parties with a revolutionary program, powerful combative trade unions that are capable of breaking with collaboration with the employers, as has been the case in Chile, as Patricia maybe will comment on later, where they in effect signed a social pact almost with the employing class, the majority of the trade union leaders, and that's been replicated across the continent, as it has indeed across the world. And the issue will be, can the workers' movement really be rebuilt as a consequence of this crisis, in terms of building and establishing fighting trade unions and mass parties, but not just mass parties. Because prior to this crisis, prior to the coming to power of a series of so-called left governments, of right-wing governments rather, you'd had a series of left governments in power, and every single one of them had in one way or another compromised with capitalism, implemented centre-left policies in the so-called in the case of Lula, gone a long way of radical reforms in the case of Chavez in Venezuela, but without breaking with capitalism, and the result ended up as a disaster because they were remained imprisoned within the capitalism. And therefore the issue is, can we really look forward to rebuilding workers' organisations, mass parties from this, and revolutionary forces that will be able to draw all the lessons from that past experience and to go forward? But it will be a period of intense polarisation, intense struggle, but it will be of an extremely sharp character because of the nature of Latin American society, as we see in the case of Brazil very clearly with Bolsonaro, as we see very clearly with the vicious repression that's been meted out by the Piñera government in Chile and across the continent in general. So it's going to be a brutal and bruising period of struggle that will open up, but we will have the opportunities in that to participate as the CWI with the comrades in Chile, with Socialismo Revolucionario, to intervene with clear policies in the programme and to take bold steps that can assist with the rebuilding of the workers' movement and building revolutionary forces that are able to ultimately challenge capitalism throughout the continent.
Thanks, Tony. And when you were speaking there, it just reminded me of the fact, I think it is 15 years ago this summer, that I had the enormous privilege of being part of a CWI visit to Brazil, where we went to Sao Paulo, I think it was, for the World Social Forum there. And it just makes you think about, what the continent has been through over the last 15 years, because at that point you had the Lula government, but you also had the launching of a new left challenge, and also you had Chavez attending a football stadium packed with people and raising the issue of socialism and so on. But as Tony has just touched on, none of those governments or those left organisations have recognised the need to break with capitalism, to put the working class in the driving seat of changing society. But I think we're seeing in this crisis some of the class nature of capitalism being exposed for greater numbers of people, the role of the working class, who's keeping society running, but also the potential power. Here in Britain, the government is relying on the trade unions to a certain extent, under pressure of the trade unions. It's a little glimpse of what's necessary, but the building of new workers' organisations is key. So there are lessons in all of those countries, but especially Chile is rich in lessons for the struggle for socialism. And that's my final question really for you, Patricio. What do you think are the prospects for winning support for socialist ideas in Chile today? Tony also touched there on the, where could that come from, the role of the lefts, but particularly I think we're interested in what is the potential for growth in support for socialist ideas, for understanding the role of the working class as the agent of socialist change in society.
Well, I think it's a big opportunity for socialist or revolutionary socialist ideas to make a mark in societies. More and more people, especially young people, but all kind of people, are open to the need to change radically the society and to establish a non-capitalist society, a socialist society. It's the movement of October and then the coronavirus has changed completely the perception of people. It's clear that capitalism now don't have the answer for those kind of crises. It's clear that we need a very strong public health system, and privatization has been real a sin against people. We have all the worldwide millions of people that have been dying because the cuts to the public health system. Here we are not the exception. So one of the main problems we have is that people working in the hospitals are not well prepared. They don't receive enough implement against this infection. We have so many people that are sick, and we have the first people in the public health sector dying. So, in spite that the epidemic in Chile is not arriving the peak, we are in fact experimenting the first path of a dramatic situation we have seen in other countries. And people understand, more people understand that we need to socialize those things, that health, education, pension need to be socialized. It's the only way out for society, but that means to confront capitalist interests and put the economy to work in favor of people, of environment. In fact, we need to rethink all the way of life we have been living in.
Thanks, Patricio, and I would absolutely agree with your outlook. Actually, I think that is definitely the case in what's
still
been
talking.
revealed. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I think Patricio's
What?
still speaking.
No, I have just finished.
Oh, sorry.
I tried to speak not so much.
Oh, no, we want to hear from you. We definitely want to hear from you. But I think in terms of what you're describing in Chile, obviously you've had the movement there, but it is an international phenomenon in terms of what this crisis is revealing. So I'll thank Patricio very much, and Tony, both our speakers today. I found that a really interesting look at the situation in Latin America, and if you've been watching this and found it interesting, we hope that you'll like the video, share the video on Facebook. If you're not yet a member of the CWI, please join, and you can get more analysis from the CWI website, socialistworld.net. You can follow the CWI on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can like our page on Facebook, Socialist World-CWI. You can follow us on Instagram at Socialist World, and all our streams are available live and to watch after on our YouTube channel, which is CWI Media. But more than that, actually, we'd like you to join us as much as you can in person. At the moment, all the parties of the CWI are holding regular meetings. They're mostly on online meetings now to discuss and debate issues like this, so that we can hear from you and we can together discuss and get clarity on the situation. We also organise in our meetings about how to support workers in struggle with socialist ideas, with members playing key roles in trade unions and workers' movements, as you've heard, in Chile, in India, in the US, in South Africa, in Europe, and so on. So you can see that more than ever we need you to be part of the CWI if you agree with the ideas and the analysis that you've heard here today, to help build that socialist voice, which, as both Tony and Patricio have shown, is going to be, you know, more needed than ever in the coming period. So please do get in touch and join us. We look forward to hearing from you, but also we hope that you'll come back for next week's Facebook Live, where we're going to be talking to CWI members in Germany. That might seem a bit like the opposite end of the spectrum. Germany is held up in the press very often as a country that has been very successful in dealing with the COVID crisis, but I'm sure our members will be able to explain that it was only an accident of timing, really, that meant that the health service hadn't been absolutely cut to the bones, because that was the plans of the capitalist class there. So we hope that you will join us and hear about the struggles, about the class consciousness developing in Germany, and I think that will also be a very interesting